John Reginald Halliday Christie was born on the 8th of April 1898 in Black Boy House, Halifax. His father Ernest was a designer for Crossley carpets at Deanclough Mills. Ernest was a member of the Halifax Conservative Party and a leading light in the Primrose League, an organisation promoting purity among the working classes. He was also the first superintendent of the St John Ambulance Brigade Halifax branch. Christie's mother, Mary Hannah, was known as Beauty Halliday before her marriage and was keen on amateur dramatics. John, one of 7 children, had a large share of his mother's affection but dreaded his disciplinarian father. "We almost had to ask if we could speak to him," he would one day write while in Pentonville prison. But the boy had a share of his father's ill temper and meanness and found few children to play with. Christie sang in the school choir and by the age of 12 became a scout and then assistant scoutmaster. At school, he was top of the class in arithmetics and algebra. He was good with his hands, able to repair watches and make toys. Once he was old enough to work, he emulated his father by helping in the first aid room and reading medical books. "I always made certain I mastered any subject I took up," he would later say, "but once I mastered it, my interest would end." 3 events in his early youth had a formative influence on Christie. When he was 8, his maternal grandmother died, and he saw the body. Later he described the trembling sensation he felt as both fascinating and pleasurable. A second event was really a continuation of the dominance his sisters had over him. They were always bossing him around, and one day his eldest sister, who was married, invited him to her home in Halifax, and while she was fastening her shoes, the young John saw her leg up to her knee. He blushed, and although she told him it was nothing to be worried about, he did exactly that. The third came in his teens after leaving school. Christie was working in the Gem Cinema in Halifax. One day he and some friends went down a lane known as the Monkey Run. They paired off and he found himself with a girl more sexually experienced than himself. He could not perform the sex act. Word got around and Christie became known as Reggie No Dick, or Can't Do It Reggie. He never forgot the humiliating experience. And there were more disasters to follow. At age 17, Christie was caught stealing while working as a clerk with the local police. He was sacked and his father banned him from the house. Job followed job, and in turn Christie became a drifter clerk, shoemaker, clerk again, and out of work. Sometimes he would sleep on his father's allotment and his mother would take him food. At 18, he was called up for service in World War I and sent to France. 2 years later, in June 1918, he was gassed. A little under 2 years later, on the 20th of May 1920, he married the placid, passive and ill-fated Ethel Waddington. Just a year later, whilst working as a postman, he was caught stealing money out of a letter and was jailed for 9 months. 2 years later, he was in trouble again, but treated leniently. The magistrate bound him over for posting as an ex-military officer and put him on probation for violence. In 1924, Christie was jailed again, this time for 9 months, for petty larceny. Accounts of his next few years varied. Christie had been deserted by his wife and continued to drift. In 1929, he was again before the courts for attacking a prostitute with whom he was living. The magistrate called it a murderous attack and gave Christie 6 months hard labour. In 1933, after yet another spell in prison for stealing a car from a Roman Catholic priest who befriended him, Christie wrote to Ethel, asking her to go back to him. She did, and remained with him until her death. In 1938, Mr. and Mrs. Christie moved into 10 Rillington Place. John had just turned 40. It was a cramped Victorian house built on 3 stories with a separate flat on each side. The street was a cul-de-sac, and number 10 was situated up against the high wall at the far end, overshadowed by an old foundry chimney. By 1949, it had an exterior so ugly and depressing that it gave an overwhelming impression of neglect and desolation. This was made worse by the dirty curtains that hung from the windows of Christie's ground floor flat, and that's where our story begins. The shabby ground floor kitchen was finally going to be cleared up. Beresford Brown, who lived in a room on the top floor, was delighted. The whole house had looked a mess ever since the war. Number 10 Rillington Place was situated in what is now London's wealthier district of North Kensington. In March 1953, the terraced cul-de-sac with crumbling stone doorways had turned into one of the most neglected streets around Ladbroke Grove. Brown had witnessed all types of tenants moving in and out of the house. Many of them had been drifters, hardly caring how they lived. Everyone in the district had known about the dreadful business in 1949, when the young Welshman Timothy Evans killed his wife and baby. They'd hanged him. The last link with those days had gone. John Christie, the quiet, balding little man who lived on the ground floor, had left. He seemed just to come and go, often bringing down-at-heel women back for a few hours or a few days. But now he had gone for good. First his wife had left, and then he followed. Beresford Brown was cheery. The previous day, the landlord had called to find that Christie had illegally rented his flat to two subtenants, a couple called Riley. They'd paid Christie £7.13, which was 3 months' rent in advance. The landlord promptly told the couple to be out by the next morning and had given Brown permission to use the ground floor kitchen. Here was a chance to use it as a home, not the depressing, rubbish-filled slum Christie had left behind. No one knew or cared where Christie had gone. He'd left the same morning that Mr. and Mrs. Riley arrived, borrowing one of their suitcases to pack some ladies' things in, as well as some photographs and frames. Christie had told them he was being transferred to Birmingham and that his wife had gone on ahead of him. Brown quickly warmed to his task, and over the next few days he carried piles of clothes, rubbish and filth into the tiny backyard alongside the washhouse. The kitchen had peeling walls, aging paint, and no amenities. Eventually he cleared all of the rubbish and was ready to make a start. He found a place where he believed he could put up some brackets to hold a radio. He tapped a wall, thought it was a rear wall, but it sounded hollow. He tapped it again, pulled away a strip of the peeling wallpaper. To his surprise, there was no wall there at all, but a papered-over wooden door. He tore down some more of the paper, shone a torch through. At first he couldn't believe what he saw. Throwing down the torch, he ran to the second floor to fetch another tenant, Ivan Williams. Cautiously they went downstairs and shone the torch into the alcove again. Sitting on a pile of rubbish was a partially clothed woman's body. She was wearing a white cotton piqué jacket, held by a safety pin, a blue bra, stockings and a pink suspender belt. Brown raced off to get the police. Police would quickly discover that 10 Rillington Place concealed not one, but several bodies. The first woman found in the alcove was attached by the bra straps to a blanket wrapped around a second body. Behind them was a third, covered in an old woolen blanket tied at the ankles with a plastic flex. All 3 women had been strangled. By the early hours of the next day, the 25th of March, a 4th dead woman had been found beneath some rubble in the front room. She was Ethel Christie. The police called a halt for the night. Officers were posted outside the house, and a guard remained there for several weeks. In the press, the detectives announced the most brutal mass killing known in London. There was one vital witness they believed could help them in their inquiries. His name was John Reginald Halliday Christie. A description of the slight middle-aged former tenant was circulated. Football crowds were asked to report any sightings at once. Christie's face appeared in every national newspaper. Meanwhile, excavation work in the tiny garden at Rillington Place revealed the skeletons of 2 more women. Medical tests showed that they'd been buried for approximately 10 years. A leading pathologist, Dr. Francis Camp, stated that both had been strangled. The skull of one of the women was missing. The search continued. Long rods were put up the chimney. An old-fashioned copper boiler was removed. Detectives and doctors came from all around, and crowds gathered outside the entrance of the small cul-de-sac. Of Christie, there was no sign. The police had not yet tracked him down, but the press knew where to find his former colleagues. During the war, Christie had been a special constable with the Emergency Reserve at the Harrow Road Police Station in West London. One of his former workmates remembered Christie well. "I worked with him on all kinds of crime investigations," the officer told reporters. "He was always secluded and reticent and never mixed with the boys, but he knew his job." In his time, he'd brought to justice thieves, blackmailers, fraudsmen, and men who were found guilty of sexual assaults on women. Unbeknown to the police at the time, the day he'd left Rillington Place, Christie had booked into Rowton House, now the Mount Pleasant Hotel in King's Cross Road. He stayed there for 7 nights and then moved on, wandering uneasily, often lost, across distant parts of London. Sometimes he found himself in East Ham, embarking miles from home. Then he would make his way back to the North Kensington area. Christie spent much of his day in cafes. In one in Pentonville Road, North London, he met a woman called Margaret Wilson and offered to procure an abortion when she confided that she was pregnant. Many women found Christie repulsive on sight, but an unfortunate few were strongly drawn by his air of authority. Christie gave boastful accounts of his power over women. "I could hardly go anywhere, but women would want to talk to me," he would say. Dozens of them. On another occasion, Christie insisted, "It wasn't me who did the chasing. Girls were attracted to me." There were many sightings of Christie. He was seen sleeping in a van, he had boarded a northbound coach, he had gone abroad. Dozens of reports were received. A woman who lived in Rillington Place, Florence Newman, reported that she'd seen Christie hanging around the cul-de-sac. One newspaper, the Daily Sketch, carried a photo fit of what he was believed to be wearing. A light brown trilby, a double-breasted overcoat with padded spiff shoulders, a belt with a black leather buckle, blue tie, pink striped shirt and brown shoes. When Christie was finally apprehended in Putney, he was wearing none of these things. It was on the 29th of March 1953, at 11:20 in the evening, that Norman Ray, chief crime reporter on the News of the World, received a phone call. "You recognise my voice?" the caller asked the reporter. Ray did. He would have known that gravelly grey anywhere. Like policemen, crime reporters have long memories. Ray had met Christie before in 1950 during the trial of Timothy Evans. "I can't stand anymore," the voice went on. "They're hunting me like a dog and I'm tired out. I'm cold and wet and I've nothing more to give." Christie told Ray that in the return for a meal, a smoke and a warm place to sit, he would give the News of the World a story about himself. Ray warned him that afterwards the police would have to be called. Christie said that he understood this, and a meeting was arranged for 1:30 a.m. that night outside Wood Green Town Hall in North London. Ray and his driver parked outside the town hall away from the street lamp, opened the car door and waited. There was a rustle in the bushes, then by chance 2 policemen approached on their beat, unaware of the meeting. Thinking he'd been betrayed, Christie fled. 2 days later, on the 31st of March, PC Thomas Ledger saw a man leaning over the embankment by Putney Bridge. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Looking for work?" The short, middle-aged man said he was waiting for an unemployment card. "Can you tell me who you are?" PC Ledger continued. "John Waddington, 35 Westbourne Grove," came the reply. The alert young officer studied the man's face, then asked him to remove his hat. The balding features confirmed Ledger's suspicion. The hunt for Christie was over. Inside the police van, Christie was asked to empty his pockets. Various bits and pieces were pulled out, including a newspaper cutting of Timothy Evans' trial in 1950. Timothy and Beryl Evans moved into the top-floor flat at 10 Rillington Place during Easter 1948. Evans, then 24, had heard of a to let sign outside the building while the couple were living with his mother and stepfather. Beryl was pregnant and the couple needed to find a place quickly. In October, their baby girl Geraldine was born. For the first time in their married life, the Evans seemed able to settle. 1 floor below them lived Charles Kitchener, a lifelong railwayman who had lived at number 10 since the 1920s. He kept himself to himself, but his failing eyesight meant he spent more and more time in the hospital. The ground floor flat was occupied by the Christies. Timothy and Beryl got on quite well with them. Ethel Christie seemed fond of the baby, although she may have noticed that her husband clearly found Beryl attractive. Later, the Evans were given the opportunity to move to a flat elsewhere, but Beryl was happy at Rillington Place and wanted to stay. Ethel Christie had promised to keep her eye on Geraldine whenever Beryl was at her part-time job. In the summer of 1949, Beryl became pregnant again. She was dismayed. The couple had little money coming in, and there were still higher purchase payments to make. Beryl decided to have an abortion. Her husband, with his Roman Catholic upbringing, was against this, but Beryl was adamant. She was still a very young woman, only 19 years old, with no interest in being tied to her home. After making some inquiries, she found there was a backstreet abortionist just a few miles away in the Edgware Road who would do the job for £1. She told several people of her intentions. One of them was Christie. Christie convinced Beryl that he could perform an abortion on her in the house. He later approached Evans and hinted at his plans. "I didn't think you knew anything about medical stuff," Evans replied. "Certainly," Christie told him, and slyly showed Evans what he called one of my medical books. Evans stared at it. There was nothing more than a first aid manual of St. John's Ambulance Brigade, but Christie knew that Evans was barely literate. Moreover, the drawings would impress him. Evans did his best for his family and worked long hours, often leaving the house at 6:30 in the morning and not returning before early evening. Mr. Kitchener, from the middle floor, was in hospital having an operation to save his sight. For most of the day, Beryl and the Christies were alone at 10 Rillington Place. It's impossible to determine exactly what happened during the operation. Workmen were at number 10 around this time making repairs to the damp plaster in the water closet and the washroom. On either the 8th of November 1949 or the day before, Evans came home to find Christie waiting for him. The operation had not been a success, Christie told Evans. Beryl had died. If Evans had gone to the police, it was possible at this time that Christie would have been charged with murder, certainly with manslaughter, as abortion was illegal at the time. But cunningly, he persuaded Evans to help him move Beryl's body into the absent Mr. Kitchener's flat. In doing this, Evans became an accessory to murder. Evans wanted to take the baby, Geraldine, round to his mother, Mrs. Probert. Christie dissuaded him, promising him that his wife would take care of the baby. When Evans returned from work on the 10th of November, Christie was again waiting, this time to say the child had been taken to a couple in East Acton who would look after her. Christie also offered to help Evans in another way. He said he would help to dispose of Beryl's body by putting it down a drain. In the days that followed, still helped by Christie, Evans sold the household furniture for a large sum of £40, even though some of it was still on hire purchase. Evans bought himself a camel coat for £19 out of the proceeds. He told Christie's wife that he was going to Bristol, but after destroying the blood-stained bedding on which Beryl had died, he went to South Wales to stay with his aunt and uncle. There was to be no peace for Evans in Wales. His mind was tortured. After a brief return to London, he told his family that Beryl had walked out on him. There were also letters from his mother, complaining about having to pay his debts. Evans finally decided there was only one thing to do. He walked into the Merthyr Vale police station and told the detective constable that he had disposed of his wife. Evans' attempts at cunning merely exposed his naivety. He thought he could clear himself without implicating Christie. Evans told the police that he had obtained a bottle containing something for his wife to procure a miscarriage. The bottle, he said, had been given to him by a man he met casually in a transport cafe between Colchester and Ipswich. His wife had found the bottle just before he went to work. He had returned home to find her dead, although he had not told her to drink the contents. He had opened a drain outside the front door, put his wife's body down it, and arranged for someone to look after the baby girl. The Merthyr Vale police contacted Notting Hill, who sent officers to search the manhole outside 10 Rillington Place. It took 3 of them to lift the cover. The drain was empty. Back in Merthyr, Evans was told the news, but insisted he had lifted the manhole cover by himself and pushed Beryl inside. When challenged directly by a detective, his statement collapsed. He made a second, this time implicating Christie as the abortionist. Another search would take place at Rillington Place. It was not very meticulous. The thigh bone of one of Christie's victims, Muriel Eady, was propped against the garden fence and left unnoticed. The search failed to unearth any bodies, but what police did find was a stolen briefcase. This was enough to get Evans arrested. Christie was asked to attend the police station and gave a masterful performance, drawing on the sense of brotherhood that existed even between former colleagues in the force. He gave details of the Evans quarrels and of the complaints by Beryl of her throat being grabbed. Another more determined search was made at Rillington Place. This time police found what they were looking for. The body of Beryl Evans was found wrapped in a green tablecloth behind a stack of wood. The body of Geraldine was found behind the door with a tie around her neck. A pathologist, Dr. Ronald Tier, reported that both victims had been strangled. Beryl's right eye and upper lip were badly swollen, and there were signs of bruising in her vagina. Dr. Tier thought of taking a swab, but others thought it unnecessary. To the police, it was now a simple domestic matter. Evans was brought back to London on Friday the 2nd of December 1949. The group arrived at Paddington Station at 9:30 p.m. Less than half an hour later, Evans made a first brief statement at Notting Hill Police Station, saying he had strangled Beryl with a rope and put her in the outside wash house after the Christies had gone to bed. 2 days later, he had strangled the baby and put her there too. Evans immediately made yet another much longer statement, his fourth in all. It took 75 minutes to write it down and read it back to him. This repeated the earlier confessions Evans had made, but went into far more detail, saying that Beryl had been getting him into deeper and deeper debt. Evans was charged with murdering his wife and daughter. The Crown decided to proceed only on the killing of the baby. There would be no possible sympathy for such a crime. Timothy Evans began trial for murder, number 1 court in the Old Bailey, on the 11th of January 1950, before Mr. Justice Lewis. The Crown was represented by Mr. Christmas Humphreys. Evans' defence was led by Malcolm Morris. Humphreys opened the case to the jury, laying stress on the confessions. There was also the evidence of the Christies. In the witness box, John Christie won sympathy by telling the judge that he had difficulty in speaking because he had been gassed during World War I. His service as a special constable confirmed the impression of a sound and dutiful citizen. Morris would have liked to base the defence on the second Merthyr confession, but it was now established that Beryl had died not from the abortion, but from strangulation. He suggested that Christie knew something more about the deaths of Mrs. Evans and her daughter, but Christie said no. That's a lie. Christie denied taking part in the abortion or having medical books, and said that he'd been in bed with enteritis and fibrositis on the day of Beryl's death. His disabilities again won the judge's sympathy. Evans gave evidence poorly. True or false, his own version of events showed him appallingly lacking in decent feeling or regard for the law. The judge summed up against Evans and the jury was out for only 40 minutes. The verdict was guilty and the sentence, death by hanging. To the end, Evans maintained that Christie had killed both Beryl and Geraldine. To his solicitors, counsel, family, priests and prison officers, he repeated the same story. After his appeal was lost on 20th of February, Evans waited patiently for a reprieve from the Home Secretary. Some public disquiet about the verdict already existed. A petition with 1,800 signatures was presented to the Home Office, but a reprieve was not granted. Evans was received back into the Roman Catholic Church, and at 8 o'clock in the morning, on the 9th of March 1950, he was hanged. It was 3 years after Evans was hanged that Christie was arrested and found guilty of murder. The news caused a sensation. 2 murderers had lived in the same house. Christie was sent to Brixton Prison and once inside made no secret of his violence against women. Solicitors, fellow inmates and eventually the press were treated to self-righteous detailed accounts of his killings. Christie compared his first victim, Austrian Ruth Fuerst, to an artist's first painting. "It is the same with me when I try to remember my first murder," he told the Sunday Pictorial newspaper. "It was thrilling because I had embarked on a career I'd chosen for myself, the career of murder. But it was only the beginning." If Christie's appearance had been shabby and anonymous, he still saw himself as a charmer of ladies. He dismissed comparison with Boris Karloff, an actor noted for horror films. "More like Charles Boyer, me," Christie would say, referring to one of the most romantic film actors of the day. But through his boastfulness, Christie's basic fear of women was plain. Flirtatious women, in particular, seemed to have troubled him the most. Women who give you the come-on wouldn't look nearly so saucy if they were helpless and dead, he said. Christie also took pride in concealing his violent intentions from the women he took back to Rillington Place until, as he put it was too late. In prison, Christie astutely realised that the main issue at this trial would have to be his own personality. He'd always been a mass of contradictions. In the evenings he would go out for a walk with his wife on his arm, tipping his hat to acquaintances, yet one day he would kill her. When he and his wife Ethel visited her family in Leeds, Christie spoke of his big house in London with servants, but he never earned more than £8 a week, the going rate for a junior clerk. In 1939, just before the war broke out, Christie had been accepted as a special constable. To all intent and purposes, he seemed a reformed character. But his petty-mindedness soon showed. He and another special were known as the Rat and the Weasel. Locals began to fear their footsteps, and it was on the beat that he met the tall, dark-haired Ruth Furst. The Austrian girl's pay and munitions factory was poor. She began to supplement her income by prostitution. Soon, she had a baby by an American soldier. She met Christie while he was trying to trace a man wanted for theft. Ruth asked him to lend her 10 shillings, and Christie, seeing his chance, invited her to 10 Rillington Place for the first time. One hot August afternoon in 1943, while Mrs. Christie was away in Sheffield, Ruth called again. I was rather backward and shy about the act of love-making on this occasion, but she was encouraging, Christie would later say. After the affair was ended, I strangled her. Christie went on to describe what he called the beauty of her appearance in death and the peace he felt. Equally grotesque was his stealthy nocturnal burial of Ruth Furst as his wife unexpectedly returned home. Christie left the police at the end of 1943 and found work at the Ultra Radio Works in West London. There he befriended Muriel Eady. He knew that Muriel suffered from catarrh and said he knew a remedy. Muriel visited Rillington Place one afternoon in October 1944, and after the cup of tea enjoyed by all of Christie's victims was shown a patent inhaler. This was a square jar with a metal lid containing perfumed water. There were 2 holes in the lid, and unknown to Muriel, a tube in one was connected to a gas pipe. Confident that the perfume would disguise the smell of gas, Christie persuaded her to inhale. Then as Muriel became drowsy, he raped her and strangled her. My second murder was a really clever murder, he would write, much cleverer than the first one. I planned it very carefully. Suddenly, as far as is known, the murders ceased. Apparently it was another 10 years before Christie would kill again. On the 14th of November 1952, Christie was awakened, in his own account, by convulsions suddenly being suffered by Ethel. His wife was now elderly and arthritic. Christie said he could do nothing to restore her breathing and decided to end her misery in the kindest way. Ethel died from strangulation. For 2 days I left my wife's body in bed, and then I pulled up the floorboards of the front room and buried her, he later said. This act of mercy caused him much pain, he claimed. From the first day I missed her, the quiet love she and I bore each other happens only once in a lifetime. Any semblance of normality Christie might have maintained vanished with the death of his wife. He sold most of the furniture and lived in a flat with his cat and dog, to which he was devoted. Between December 1952 and March 1953, Christie stalked, lured, and murdered 3 more women. Kathleen Maloney was a 26-year-old prostitute from Southampton. She was killed after she had posed nude while Christie took photographs. Her body was then bundled into an alcove in the kitchen. Rita Nilsson was a 26-year-old prostitute from Belfast. She just found out that she was pregnant when she disappeared on the 12th of January. 26-year-old Scottish lady Hectorina McLennan would be his final victim. She met Christie in a cafe and was offered accommodation. It was something of a surprise when she turned up with her boyfriend. They stayed at Rillington Place for 3 nights. On the 6th of March, Christie followed them to the Labour Exchange. While Hectorina's boyfriend Alexander went in to sign on, Christie persuaded Hectorina to come back to the flat. Christie had given her a drink and started to get his gas appliance to work. She saw it, became unhappy, and there was a struggle. He strangled her, raped her, and then placed her body in a sitting position with bra hooked to Maloney's legs to keep her body in an upright position. His pride in his artistry was undimmed. Christie was keen to show that a decent, respectable grace was present in his actions. I gave them a merciful exit, he said. Christie's confessional outpourings, however, did not mean that he intended to plead guilty. He was still a ruthless, calculating man who hoped to cheat the gallows by proving that his homicidal mania was in some way excusable. Clearly no jury would accept this if it believed Christie had killed a baby. The prosecution was equally concerned not to implicate Christie in Geraldine's death. It would mean they had hanged an innocent man. Christie's trial began in the No. 1 court at the Old Bailey on the 22nd of June 1953. In the same courtroom, just 3 years prior, he had stood in the witness box and denied killing Beryl Evans. Now he would retrace his footsteps and admit that he had. Like Timothy Evans, Christie was tried on only one charge, yet by now the entire country knew that a mass killer of women would be on public view, being tried for his life. Christie had by this stage confessed to 7 killings, 2 women in 1943, Beryl Evans in 1949, his wife Ethel in 1952, and 3 other women in 1953. His counsel, Derek Curtis Bennett, was eager for the courts to hear of all of these cases and any others of which the prosecution may know. It had been a painstaking task by the police to unearth the full extent of the events at Rillington Place. At 6 a.m. on the 18th of May, Beryl Evans' body had been exhumed from its grave at Kensington Borough Cemetery in Gunnersbury for examination by the 3 leading pathologists of the day, Keith Simpson, Francis Camps, and Donald Tare. The body of Geraldine, for whose murder her father had been hanged, lay with her mother. There had been lengthy efforts to identify the victim's bones in the case of Ruth First, Christie's first known victim. A skull had been reconstructed out of 110 separate pieces. Christie wrote to an old acquaintance from prison that he was fuddled and dazed by his predicament. He longed for sweets, cigarettes, and the taste of an apple, but also spoke of the prison warder's consideration. At the end of his formal confessions, he had written, "I wish to state that I am most grateful to the police in charge for this kindly way in which I have been treated in Putney's police station." Christie took care in his written confessions to provide explanations for each of the killings. The prostitutes had forced themselves upon him and things had got out of hand. His wife had to be put out of her pain. Edie and Beryl Evans had also been given forms of mercy killings, according to Christie. The Old Bailey courtroom was packed. Distinguished people from many walks of life were present. Christie, dressed in a blue pinstripe suit, was charged with murdering his wife and pleaded not guilty. Christie's counsel, Curtis Bennett, told the jury that he would establish a defense of insanity. He stated that at the time of his actions, Christie did not know what he was doing and did not know that they were wrong. You can have no doubt, doctors or no doctors, that at the time he did each of these killings, including that of his wife, he was mad in the eyes of the law, said Curtis Bennett. Christie walked to the witness box, apparently almost in tears, and took half a minute to mumble the oath. He constantly clasped his hands, pulled an ear, tugged his collar, and smoothed his bald head as he answered questions. He could recall some murders and not the others. Asked by his counsel if he had committed any murders between 1943 and 1949, Christie replied, "I don't know." "Do you mean you have?" "I might have done. I don't know whether I did or not," Christie said, but he was more defining when questioned about the 1949 itself. "Did you kill the baby, Geraldine Evans?" "No," came Christie's reply. The judge, Mr. Justice Finnemore, pressed Christie on this evidence at the Evans trial. Christie became evasive. "You were not lying about the baby, but why did you lie about Mrs. Evans?" "Well, I was accused of killing both of them," Christie said. The medical evidence was divided. Dr. Jack Hobson, senior psychiatrist at Middlesex Hospital, met Christie 10 or more times in prison and gave evidence of his supposed horror of masturbation and of public houses. In fact, Christie frequented run-down pubs and semen stains were found on his clothing. Hobson said that Christie was not responsible. The tricks of memory are avoidance of getting down to disturbing topics to preserve his own self-respect rather than to avoid incriminating himself. The Crown's medical witnesses rejected this. In particular, Dr. Desmond Curran of St. George's Hospital expressed the view that Christie was abnormal and conceited, but not suffering from any form of hysteria. On the 4th day of the trials, the judge began summing up. The jury was sent out at 4:05 p.m. and returned 82 minutes later. "Do you find the prisoner guilty or not guilty?" the jury was asked. "We find him guilty." John Reginald Halliday Christie was due to be hanged. An inquiry was quickly set up to see if Timothy Evans had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. With Christie's execution only 3 weeks away, and his trial being over, there were clamours for a more wide-ranging inquiry. Could two stranglers have operated independently, unknown to each other, in such a tiny house? Christie was sentenced on the 25th of June 1953. The next day, the Labour opposition in Parliament pressed the reluctant government to review the entire Rillington Place affair. On the 6th of July, the Home Secretary Sir David Maxwell Fyfe appointed the Recorder of Portsmouth, John Scott Henderson, to study whether there was any ground of thinking there may have been a miscarriage of justice. Henderson had to move quickly. His report had to be compiled before Christie went to the gallows. The task was immense. Before his appointment, he had been asked to study all the relevant documents in the Evans case. To these, he now had to add the Christie documents. Henderson also had to hold discussions with the counsel for both Evans and Christie, and with numerous other officials in the case. He would also later hold a 75-minute meeting with Christie himself. Christie's permission for this had been obtained by a senior police officer assisting in the inquiry. The officer had warned Christie that he would be questioned about Geraldine Evans, but gratuitously added that there was no evidence that he had ever killed her. The report, presented on the 13th of July, bewildered people on both sides of the debate. It concluded that the case against Evans for murdering his daughter had been overwhelming. Moreover, the report suggested that Evans murdered his wife. In other words, Christie had told the truth at Evans' trial, but lied at his own, and there were two stranglers at 10 Rillington Place. Christie, now in his death cell, enjoyed a status that had during his life never before been conferred on him, but 2 days before his execution, an old acquaintance found him a broken man. "I don't care what happens to me anymore. I've nothing to live for," said Christie. His solicitor announced there would be no formal appeal against the conviction or the sentence. Christie wrote to another friend that he was in reasonable sorts and enjoying the food. "I could really compliment our cook," he wrote. "It is really well cooked and plentiful. I'm even putting on weight." It's possible that at the time he was suffering from the condemned cell syndrome of weight grief. Many prisoners relieved of the ordeal of the trial actually put on weight whilst they're awaiting execution. Christie sold his story to the Sunday Pictorial, but his lurid descriptions of the crimes did nothing to lift the veil of mystery. Few people apart from abolitionists mourned that Christie would soon be executed, but the events of 1949 and the murders of Beryl and Geraldine Evans needed further explanation. Dr. Hobson, the psychiatrist who had testified for the defence at Christie's trial, was refused permission to see Christie again. Hobson was outraged by this, believing that Christie's decaying memory could be revived and the exact fate of Geraldine Evans discovered if handled delicately. The Evans family and their supporters were not satisfied. There had been medical evidence of an attempt to penetrate Beryl Evans sexually after her death. This had not been produced at Evans' trial, but if true, then it becomes inconceivable that Evans killed his wife. The lawyers considered it too awful to present evidence of necrophilia to a jury. In 1949, science was not yet able to carry out conclusive tests on semen. There was also evidence from the workmen who renovated Christie's flat. Evans' supporters claimed this could have shown that Evans' dates for the killings were wrong, and that the bodies would not have been in the washroom when he said they were. But the workmen were never called to give their evidence. Suspicions also fell on Christie's claim made at Evans' trial that his bad back prevented him from lifting weights. He had not complained about this until after Beryl Evans' death. Was it not possible that the pain was caused by lifting her body? There was a crowd of about 200 people outside Pentonville Prison at 9 a.m. on the morning of the 15th of July 1953. People had come from as far as Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and even Australia and the United States. One lorry driver announced he'd managed to get himself an overnight run and reached the prison just in time. Despite this, the authorities had expected a larger and more troublesome crowd. There were none of the incidents seen at Wandsworth Prison earlier in the year when a teenager of limited mental powers, Derek Bentley, was hanged for killing a police officer. A dozen constables stood with arms linked as reinforcements stood by outside the gates. Inside, the public executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, stood ready with Christie. At 9:10, a warder appeared at the gates with a black-edged notice which he pinned up on the board. It was announced that John Reginald Halliday Christie had been executed. 13 years later, 16 years after Timothy Evans had been hanged, he was granted a free pardon. His remains were exhumed from Pentonville on the 18th of October 1966 and reinterred into holy grounds in November 1966. There is still some debate to this day that Timothy Evans killed his wife Beryl. The general consensus is that Christie murdered her. However, some of Beryl's family still insist that Timothy killed her.